Welcome back, everyone. Michael here with Offshore Citizen. Today, we are going to answer a question that one of our viewers had. They asked me to please compare and contrast temporary residency, permanent residency, and citizenship. So we're going to dive into that and give you the full explanation and how they might apply to you. Before we do that, though, if you have not already, please, we would love it if you would just hit the subscribe button and the notification bell. If you like the video, please give it a thumbs up. If you don't, then please tell us in the comments. On top of that, if you are at all interested in getting residency somewhere else, if you're interested in knowing where to go and get residency, if you're interested in citizenship by investment, alternative passports, international tax planning, how to pay the lowest legal amount of tax possible, offshore company formation, international banking, payment processing, etc., please reach out to us. You can book a call with me, clarity.fm/Michael Rosmer. There's a link below, or you can visit our websites, offshorecitizen.net, offshorecapitalist.com. With that in mind, let's get into it. Okay, so let's start on the far end. I've already got a video contrasting residency and citizenship, which alarmingly a lot of people do tend to get confused by. Somebody will say, oh, I'm going to get my citizenship. It's like, no, you're going to get residency. And I actually just earlier today was talking to somebody who was mentioning kind of a confused concept where they're like, oh, hey, I'm going to go and buy a passport in this place, and they didn't want to buy a passport somewhere else because they didn't want to live there. It's like, well, no, you don't have to live where you buy the passport, and you're able to live places where you don't have a passport. So separating those out, let's talk about this. What is a citizenship? Okay, a citizenship typically means a few things. You get access to the passport, so it affects your visa-free travel, okay? That is the number one factor. So residencies mostly, and I'll give you the exceptions in a minute, do not affect your visa-free travel, okay? We're gonna go in, like I said, in a second about what the exceptions to that are. And so there can be some that might be useful to you. But you get visa-free access based on the passport, and maybe you don't get any extra because you've already got them. It depends on the country. The second thing is you typically get a right to vote, okay? So you have the ability to vote, and you have access to all the services, you have the right to live there and to work there. So basically you can do anything with respect to that country. You're under that country's overarching protections, okay? Residency, and we're referring here to legal residency as opposed to tax residency, okay? Kind of two separate things that you can sometimes be legally resident without being tax resident, and you can be tax resident without being legally resident, okay? Now, legal residency is fundamentally the right to live in a country, okay? It may or may not include the right to work in that country. It will not include the right to vote. It will not allow you to get the passport, okay? So that's kind of the major difference. Now, this comes down a little bit to temporary residency versus permanent residency, okay? If you're a permanent resident, then you will typically have the right to work in that country. You will have most of the rights of a citizen within that country, okay? So when you leave that country, you don't typically have much in the way of rights that kind of carry with you. But within that country, you will have a lot of them. You will not, again, have the right to vote, etc., but you will have the right to work. You will typically have access to, the public services, etc., right? So the healthcare, the education, the things that go along with that. A permanent residency is a little bit of a misnomer because in practice, it's not necessarily permanent. Or rather, if you don't do some things to maintain it, you can lose it, okay? So for instance, if you have permanent residency in Canada, you need to spend a certain amount of time physically in Canada every 5 years in order to maintain that, okay? And this varies from country to country. Some countries have, very little, if any, requirements, and some countries have, much more. Others, it's like, say a 10-year residency. So you're like, okay, great, I get it. I have access for 10 years. After the 10 years, I just have to renew it, but it's not like I have to have maintained a whole bunch of time there. So depending a little bit on the country, that can vary. So permanent can mean really long term, okay? Temporary clearly expires, right? Usually temporary residence permits are anywhere from 1 year to 5 years, I would say, depending on the country, okay? It's very, very common that you'd have a 1 year that you can just keep renewing year after year, so long as you meet the standards. And then eventually after, say, 5 years, you can roll it over into a permanent residency. In some cases, you'll get maybe a 2 year or a 3 year. So for instance, In Mexico, you can often go and you can get a 1 year and then you can expand it into a 3 year. In Portugal, you can start with a 2 year and then add another 3 years after that, and then after 5 years it can become permanent. So this is kind of like a normal progression. So the normal progression, you typically don't come in and just get permanent residency in a country. There are a few exceptions when you actually invest a decent amount of money, buy some property, things like this. But most of the time what happens is that you would start on a temporary residence permit, okay? Like I said, very often that's like an annual residency that you renew year after year. And then after, say, 5 years, 5 is like a really typical number, then you apply, you can roll that into permanent residency. And permanent residency, again, could be a really long-term residency that's not necessarily truly permanent, but effectively like that. Okay, check my microphone here, make sure it's not going off. So that's that. Now, temporary residency permits may not give you full access to everything that goes along there. So very often that residency permit has some restrictions on it, okay? So for instance, you may have a retirement visa, okay? So if you have some sort of retirement visa, it may be a temporary residency permit that allows you to be there, but it doesn't allow you to work there. Similarly, maybe you have a visa that allows you to open a business, or that you get opening a business, and you're allowed to do business there, but you're not allowed to work there. So countries are quite defensive about the jobs going on. Now, what I recommend to people very often is I say, hey, listen, if you want to go there and work, sometimes the best way is still to go and open a business and then contract to local companies, and you can make that work and kind of get around that requirement. But one way or another, this is something that is worth keeping in mind, okay? Now, the last thing that I want to separate that from is, and then I'll go into kind of the last piece of how you can expand your visa-free travel based on a residency, is we're going to talk just quickly about tourist visas. Okay, so one of the question is, well, why would I want to get a residency permit at all versus having a tourist visa? And the answer usually is, hey, you can stay there all year round. So a tourist visa typically will give you, depending on the country and what your requirements are from that place, 30 days up to 6 months in a year that you're allowed to be there. So if you want to be there all year round, you cannot do that on a tourist visa typically, right? Again, there might be like the odd exception. I can think of a couple offhand, but most of the time you can't. And so that's why you would go and apply for a residency permit as opposed to getting a tourist visa. And by the way, that's true even if, so for instance, it's quite common that you would get a visa, like a tourist visa for the US, and it'd be like a 10-year visa. But that wasn't that you could actually be there for 10 years. It was that you had your visa-free access, or not visa-free access, but it allowed you to spend a certain amount of time as a tourist in the country during a 10-year period of time, and then you had to go through the process again. So anyway, I hope that helps. Now, last point. I did mention that sometimes residency permits can expand your visa-free travel, and this is true. So for instance, if you become a resident of Canada, that can give you access to a lot of countries that you wouldn't normally have access to in the Caribbean. Similarly, if you have a Schengen visa, you'll get access to some of the Dutch overseas territories, things like this, right? Best example, of course, is any Schengen visa. So one of the things I talk to people quite a bit about these days, and you kind of hear me talk on this channel, is listen, let's say that you, like for me, the beauty and the drawback of the Schengen zone is, hey, listen, there's no borders between there. And so what this means is I can freely move between those countries. Great, amazing, fantastic. The downside is collectively they have the same amount of time you can spend there. So for instance, whereas I could go to Croatia, spend 3 months, then go to Bulgaria, spend 3 months, then go to Romania, spend 3 months, no problems. So I would have spent 9 months out of 9 months in the European Union, right? I couldn't do that where I spend 3 months in Portugal, then 3 months in Spain, then 3 months in France, because you get a Schengen visa and you get 3 months out of every 6 months that you're allowed to be in the Schengen zone. So that's a drawback, right? Whereas if you have a residency permit in any Schengen country, then you have access to all the Schengen countries all year round. So this hence opens up the whole thing that, hey, listen, if I want to be exploring Europe long term, in particular the Schengen zone, then it pays to have a Schengen visa. In addition, if I want to maybe I may be able to get access to a country, just for random example, let's say I wanted to be in Sweden, right? But it might be paying to get a Swedish visa so I can go and get a residency permit in another Schengen country, which then gives me access to Sweden. So anyway, I hope that helps. If you're interested in figuring out, what's the best place for you, where might be, a good place to get a residency permit, a citizenship, should you buy a citizenship, should you get a residency by investment, should you do it via opening a company or something like that, reach out to us. Happy to help you. Happy to help you with, again, international tax planning. So usually people on this channel want to minimize their tax, etc. Forming companies, opening bank accounts, etc. You can, again, book a call with me, clarity.fm/Michael Rosmer, link below, or offshorecitizen.net and offshorecapitalist.com. And if you haven't already, smash the subscribe button, and I'm going to see you guys on the next video.